which Pilate was perhaps a member of as well. So if we're going to meet people like Pilate, we're going to meet Pilates in our life. And if 70% of our population fall into that camp, we need to address the issue of truth. Just because Pilate didn't stay to listen to Jesus' answer about truth doesn't mean he didn't give them. And so for the balance of the time we have left this morning, we're going to go through quickly and look at why truth is important. Why is it important that we know the truth? And then secondly, what is truth? If you'll think with me for a minute and open up your Bibles to Jeremiah chapter 10, I think the first reason that truth, that it's important for us to know truth, is that without truth, we are lost. Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23, the prophet says, "It is not within man who walks to direct his steps." The wise man in Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 12, this was actually referenced in the Bible class this morning. The wise man says, "There is a way that seemeth right unto man, but the end of that way is death." Christine and I coach a future problem-solving team, and our topic is space. So I've been reading some Hawking and some other really smart people who are a lot smarter than me about space. And it's amazing, right? It's amazing what the knowledge of man has been able to accomplish. We went to the moon. Some of you perhaps saw us land on the moon. I'm told, from what I've read, we have the technology now that we can get to Mars if we want to. Science has given us medicine and great feats of infrastructure and cure disease, but there is a limit to our human understanding. As our brother James Burton Kaufman wrote, apart from God, man is ignorant of his origin, his destiny, and the meaning of life. He cannot see one split second into the future, but builds his house the day before an earthquake, elects scoundrels to public office, and in all social political considerations moves with the intelligence of a buffalo herder on stampede. Even in the areas of his greatest achievements, man is embarrassed by the fact that the very truth he has discovered only raised 100 other questions harder than the ones he has solved. Man's vaunted knowledge has only multiplied his ignorance. God found that to be true, brethren. No matter how long I go in school or how many classes I take, each new thing I learn seems to unlock 100 other locked doors that I don't understand. The more I seem to learn, the less I seem to know about the world as it turns out. And if you look at the world, there are some things scientists can't tell us. They don't know where we've come from. Oh, they can get you back to a dot the size of the end of a period, but even the people who believe in that can't tell you where the period came from. I've been reading from those folks. They'll tell you, they'll admit, we don't know where that came from. They don't know where we came from. They don't know where we're going. I've read a lot of scientific papers in my life, but I've never read one where the researcher and his lab partner got together, and the researcher held in his arms a video camera and scientific instruments, and he said to his lab partner, "Okay, kill me." And his lab partner axed him, and then he was gone for 2 or 3 weeks on a big research excursion, and then he comes back and writes a big research paper on what happened on the other side of death. They don't know. We don't know. The scientists don't know what happens on the other side of your death. They don't know how we got here. They don't know where we're going. And most troubling of all is they don't know what we're doing here, right? With our scientific knowledge, we can't figure exactly out what our purpose is. We've got no understanding of what our purpose is, and that's very sad, because I suspect the relativists would say, well, it just depends on what our perspective is. We could be here for all different purposes. But how tragic to live 50 years pursuing one elusive purpose, only to get to that point and look back and say, oh, I had the wrong perspective the whole time, and now my life is a waste. I have no time to pursue the purpose. You see, without an anchor of truth, you are adrift. And it is difficult to find sustainable fulfillment in our lives. We need to know the truth, because without the truth, we are lost. Second, know the truth so important, because it is the truth that sets us free. John 8, beginning in verse 31 through 32, Jesus tells his disciples, if you continue in my word, are my disciples indeed, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Now wait just 1 minute, Drew. I'm a citizen of the United States of America, and as such, I am a free man. Well, that's very interesting that you bring that up, because that's exactly what the Jews said in the same passage. Well, they're not United States citizens, but they said, we're Jews. We've always been free, which is actually historically inaccurate for their statement. But they said, we're Jews. We're free people. We've always been free. And so Jesus clarifies in verse 34 and says, whosoever committed sin is a slave or a servant to sin. So let's get this straight. Everybody who sins is a slave to sin. The way in which we can be free from sin is through truth. And so if there is no truth, we're in a great deal of trouble. Because we're told in Romans chapter 3 and in verse 23 that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Based on what we just read, that would make each and every one of us slaves to sin. And if there is no truth, all of us without hope. Because Romans 6 and verse 23 also tells us that the wages or the result of being a slave or a servant of sin is death. And so, friends, without truth, if there is no truth, we cannot know the truth. We are all hopelessly enslaved to sin with no ability to obtain our freedom. We must know the answer to the question that was posed by Pilate, because without it, we're lost. We don't know where to go. We don't know where we're from. We don't know what we're doing here without truth. And second, without truth, we are in bondage and slave to sin. So now the answer. The answer to Pilate's question is so ironic. One of the great ironies of all time, that Pilate asked the question, what is truth? When it was staring at him right in the face. Look over John, the Gospel of John, chapter 14. Jesus is warning his disciples that he's about to leave the earth. And he notes, you should not be troubled because I'm preparing a place for you. I'm preparing a mansion for you as well. And Thomas answers, well, no, Lord, don't go because we don't know where you're going. We don't know the way. And Jesus says in verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. Pilate did not let Jesus finish, but if he would have, Jesus could have answered in one word. What is truth? Pilate asked. Jesus could respond, me. Now why is that the case? Jesus explains, carrying on there in verse 7 and verse 9, chapter 14, which is to know Jesus is to know God. It's further developed and elaborated upon at the very beginning of John's Gospel. John chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, we are told that in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was together in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and nothing was made without Him. In Him was life, and that life was the light of all men. Then you skip down to verse 14, and it says, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Hear this. Jesus is truth because He is the full and complete revelation of deity, who came to earth that man could see with his own senses the glory of God. How did Jesus show us God? Well, Matthew chapter 17, He was transfigured on the mountain. His face became as bright as the sun. His raiment became as white as snow. And He gave us countless miracles. As you'll remember, He turned the water into wine. He fed the multitude with a few bread and fish. He calmed the tempest. He walked upon the water. He caused the blind to see, the lame to walk, and He returned the dead to life. But it was not just with the supernatural that Jesus showed man on earth the glory of God. He also showed it in His teachings and the way that He lived His life. Matthew 5, He taught us to love our enemies and our neighbors. He taught us we ought to be faithful to and respect our wives. That we ought to be honest with each other. And then if we're compelled to go 1 mile, that we ought to go 2. Matthew 6, we ought to forgive the people who trespass against us. That we ought to give help to other people just because it's the right thing to do and not because we want the praise of men. In Matthew 7, that we ought to treat other people the way that we want to be treated. Matthew 8, that we ought to examine ourselves first before we start picking at other people. Matthew chapter 25, we ought to feed the hungry. We ought to clothe the naked. We ought to shelter the homeless. We ought to care for the sick. And we ought to visit the imprisoned. And most of all, and above all, Jesus showed us the great power of sacrificial love when he sacrificed his own life on the cross for our sins and short. God knows in the world that we live in. He knows.